Hi, I'm Eric Benfeld with Virginia Cooperative Extension and Virginia Tech, and I'm for the soil, both for my children and future generations, viable agriculture, local waterways, and the protection of natural resources. Thank you for being part of this conversation and the For the Soil podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and Eric Benfeld will be joining us in just a few moments with the world champion of soil judging, Clare Tallamy, a senior at Virginia Tech, and we'll have that conversation. It's actually part two of a two-part conversation coming up in just a few moments. But before we get to that, I would like to remind everyone of the website forthesoil.org, specifically a new blog entry. And this is a webinar that was presented by Dr. David Montgomery. He was joined by Eric Benfeld and Mary Sketch Bryant in December, and they talked a lot about numerous aspects of soil health. They talked about his most recent book called Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. They talked about microbial activity in the soil. I think you'll find it really interesting. And that's on our website, forthesoil.org. And then in the upper menu bar, just click on blog, and there you will see a conversation with Dr. David Montgomery, Roots and Ripples of Soil Health. Now let's get to today's podcast. Thank you everyone for joining us for this episode of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm Jeff Ishii, and Eric Benfeld with Virginia Cooperative Extension. Community Viability is joining us. And Eric, we do have a very special guest today, Clare Tallamy. Clare is she is the reigning world champion of soil judging. There was a competition that took place last fall over in Europe, and Clare Tallamy from Virginia won that international competition. We'll talk with Clare all about that. By the way, if you missed the initial part of this conversation, we would encourage you to go back to our website, forthesoil.org, and then you'll find part one of our conversation with Clare Tallamy. Today's episode is part two of that conversation, and I laugh because we were joking around with Clare during the break about her dominance and Virginia Tech's dominance in the world of soil judging. Did you know that Virginia Tech has won the soil judging competition? They've had 7 national championships, so it's not a fluke. They are dominant in the world of soil judging, and we owe a lot of gratitude to the professors, the team, the coaches, everyone at Virginia Tech who makes that possible. But Virginia Tech has won 7 national championships when it comes to soil judging, and that's exactly what we were talking about with Clare Tallamy in this part two of that conversation.
Yeah. Is there anything?
I mean, you're kind of like the Alabama of soil judging. You know, you got this, we want Bama. All the soil judging people are saying, yeah, we want Virginia Tech. We bring them on.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it helps on my resume to say I'm from Virginia Tech and I'm on the soil judging team. It does not hurt me whatsoever. It looks really good.
One thing that you mentioned in the first episode that we talked with you, Clare, is about the diversity of Virginia geography and topography. And that's something Dr. John Galbraith was a guest on this episode well over a year ago, but he talked about that diversity and how fortunate we are that we have almost anywhere you go in Virginia, you've got soils that are ideal for peanuts. And then you got soils that are ideal for wine grapes. Then you've got soils that are ideal for vegetable production. Can you talk about that diversity and kind of the history behind it?
Yeah. So I've worked for a cooperative extension before as well, and that was on the coastal plain, mostly vegetable production out there. It was pretty fun to get to see the diversity of crops, as well as the diversity of soils. Especially out there, you get some wetland soils, which I find particularly fascinating. And then really soils in Virginia are dominated by the geological landscape that we have. So we have these physiographic regions, right? So we have the coastal plain, which is, think Richmond, you have the ocean, it's very sandy. And so those are entirely unconsolidated coastal plain deposits. So they're essentially all sand. And then you get into the Piedmont, which is an extremely ancient foothill landscape. And those are almost entirely ultisols, or those highly leached soils I talked about, orange, red, super deep, extremely acidic, or like low base saturation. So oftentimes you are having to add these kind of fertilizers, and then you get into the Blue Ridge, which is a mountain range, a mountain province. And that's where you can sometimes get shallow soils, especially with bedrock that's hard to erode. So then you're getting land that's more in forest or apple orchards or wine grapes. I'm from Loudoun County, so we have Piedmont and Blue Ridge we're bridging that gap. So we have a huge wine region. I love it, my parents love it, but that's the kind of agriculture that really the Blue Ridge has. And then you get into Valley and Ridge, which is where Blacksburg is, and that's where you get just these valley and ridges, honestly. It makes for beautiful hiking, but not a lot of kind of that intensive agriculture goes on here, again, because of some of those shallow soils on the ridges. In the valleys, though, you have beautiful limestone soils. They're really deep. They're very nice. They're fertile. And then finally, you're on the Appalachian Plateau. That's essentially West Virginia. But again, those kind of mountainous landscapes. So that's really where the diversity of soils comes from, is that geological landscape.
And Claire, at least sort of a question or somewhat of a tension that I've heard within soil science is you do have, how soils are being formed from the geology, but then some of the soil ecologists and biologists are thinking that farmers and landowners can have a more of a role in building topsoil through their management. As a soil scientist and soil judge, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I do believe that farmers and homeowners do have the power to create topsoil, I guess, because acre horizons or surface horizons are dominantly, or should be dominantly, organic matter mixed with that kind of mineral substrate. But you do have the power to change your soil. And I know that because I did that at my house. So I'm from Loudoun County, like I said. Loudoun County is full of Triassic basins, which are kind of these ancient sedimentary basins. They're really red. I also live on a terrace of the Potomac River. That's my geologic soil place. Anyway, because I live in the suburbs, they stripped all of our topsoil when I was younger. We had nothing, but my parents are avid gardeners and they tried for years to get good topsoil. And it's been a very intense experience with my dad, who's an engineer and a researcher, and he just researched so much about soil health and so much about how to create topsoil. And we have successfully gotten really good topsoil. It's really dark, it's gorgeous, it's like really soft. I love digging in it. There's just no feeling like, we created this and we have the power to change our soil for the better. And you can tell because I'll dig down sometimes and hit that kind of Triassic clay, or that really just, there's nothing really going on underneath the topsoil that we created. And it took a couple of years for sure, but I think it's all worth it for healthier food.
What were some of the, practices that you used to build the topsoil at your house there in Loudoun County?
Yeah, so we have they're not really raised beds. They're essentially like beams that we've stuck in the ground to kind of keep the grass out of our garden. But most of our yard is gardens. And so we compost regularly with kitchen scraps and yard scraps. And so we have a huge composting area. And I actually did a lot of research on composting earlier in my college career. So I really looked at like how we could improve that. So we made our compost pad a little bit bigger to generate more heat and more mass and stuff like that. And then in the wintertime, something really important that we do is we actually cover all of our gardens with leaves or grass clippings to kind of keep everything in there. Also, that organic matter will decompose into our soil over the wintertime, kind of slowly, and then we till it back in with a rototiller in the spring when we're getting ready to plant. Yeah, sometimes I add fertilizer, but mostly it's those organic matter additions from composting. And then we rototill sometimes, but I usually just use it. I actually started an experiment in my garden this year in which I stopped tilling and I just have this little plot, and then I let everything grow there and didn't till. And so now I just have this kind of, it's interesting. As a budding scientist, I think it's interesting no matter what happens, but it's just kind of like mossy. There's a biocrust, if you will, and a biocrust is like that covering of moss and lichen that kind of covers the soil surface and keeps it in place. It's pretty interesting. Our garden is definitely an experiment.
You bring up some really interesting points. It makes me want to ask about broad forks, but don't get me down that road. We'll be talking the rest of the day. We're talking with Clare Tallamy. She is the individual winner of the International Soil Judging Contest that was held in Scotland just a few months ago. She is a senior in environmental sciences at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. And while we're on the topic of gardening, Clare, let's talk gardening 101. We've got, I see kind of a back to the land movement since we went through COVID. A lot of new gardeners, people that really have no idea. They go out into the backyard and all they see is lawn, but they want a garden. So how do you know what you got? How do you do a soil test? Describe that whole initial procedure to me.
Of course. I actually had to describe this to people during COVID because during COVID, I had nothing to do but work on my garden, and I already love gardening. So I was here for it. People would walk by our yard, and we have the type of yard that people stop and look, so they ask us questions about our garden. And I'd always be talking about what varieties I'm growing, how I take care of it. But I think the first thing you do when you're starting a garden, let's say you walk outside and all you see is grass. It's kind of sad. First thing you got to do is soil test. This awesome quote from Arkansas Extension is, "Don't guess, soil test." I have a sticker that says that, and it's my favorite thing. Anyway, so you clear your sod and the space that you want your garden, and then you can soil test. Usually they suggest using a soil probe and sticking it down 6 inches, creating a sample, sending it to Virginia Tech. Obviously, home gardeners are probably not going to have soil probes, so you can just use a trowel and kind of get a homogenized sample. So mixing up different parts of your garden plot, sending that in. And then what you can get from that soil test is kind of a list of what nutrients are already in the soil. And then you can also get suggestions for what fertilizer to add. If you don't have the time to soil test, that's okay. You can always check Web Soil Survey if you want to be more informed about your soil. But usually in Virginia, it's a pretty safe bet to just add like a standard fertilizer that you buy at Home Depot if you're a home gardener. Miracle-Gro will probably do, just to kind of jumpstart your garden. And then I think it's hard starting out because when you look at gardening, there's so many things that take so much time. And so I think you can kind of put a lot of pressure on yourself to be a perfect gardener at first and have a perfect composting pile and have the most beautiful orchard or something. But I think starting out small and just relying on chemical fertilizers is okay starting out, just to get a handle on it. And then you can start composting. Then you can start, trying out different varieties and how your crops are laid out. And then you can try, maybe a no-till garden if you're feeling like that. But yeah, starting out small, soil testing is a perfect way to start.
And Clare, well, I personally want to thank you for being an ambassador for soil science, soil judging, and soil health. And
yeah,
as a student, and I don't know how you might advise colleagues that are thinking about careers. It seems like you have certainly have a passion for soil judging and purpose, and certainly persistence in learning about soil judging. What advice would you have for colleagues that are looking both at university as well as different career choices in environmental sciences and soil sciences?
Yeah, so I'm actually an ambassador for a college here at Virginia Tech. So I talk to a lot of incoming students, a lot of freshmen about career options. I actually just talked to people about this today. And when I was just starting out in college, it was really, really scary. There's so many options. I ended up landing in, I really want to go into academia because I love learning. I never want to stop learning. This is what I want to do. But there are actually, with environmental science and soil science, like I said earlier in the other podcast, there are endless options. You could study anything with soil. So I've worked for cooperative extension. I've worked for the NRCS. I've worked for even just like small companies. I've had friends work for consulting doing soil science. So really, there's so many options and you're only limited by your imagination. Hate that cliche, but really you are with soil science. So it's really up to you where you want to live, where you envision yourself going. But I believe you can study soil science wherever you are.
Just a couple of minutes remaining. And once again, we're talking with Clare Tallamy, individual winner of the International Soil Judging Contest. And one final question for me, Clare, and that's about the soil telling a story. You talked about these profiles in the soil judging pits. And I've been told that every soil has a story to tell about what happened in that particular spot over a period of history. What's the most interesting story you've come across?
I think you really hit the nail on the head with story. That's what I love about soil judging, is I get to look at the whole landscape and really tell the story of what's going on. And I think maybe the most interesting one, or maybe the most recent interesting one I can remember, is we saw a floodplain soil in South Carolina. And floodplains are really fun because that's where you really get into like stories, because you can actually date some of these flood events to hurricanes, especially in South Carolina. So you get these really cool deposits of just, you could get sand and then clay and then sand or silt and then kind of like these stratifications. And my favorite part was in the bottom was just these beautiful like ribbons of black organic matter in the super sandy subsoil. And I just think it's really cool that after all these years, that kind of deposit remains. The soil always remembers, is what Dr. John Galbraith says. And I really think that that's true, because we can still see evidence of that hurricane maybe from 100, 200 years ago today. And we just dug it up and we're like, oh, wow, a hurricane happened here 200 years ago. That's crazy.
That is amazing. And I want to thank you for your time. Final question, and that's, I'm sure Eric would ask the same question about resources. If people wanted to get more information about soil health, what would be your advice?
Yeah, so a huge resource for soil health in Virginia is the For the Soil website. Obviously, I'm talking to the For the Soil people. You can also talk to your local extension agent. They usually have a ton of resources and can connect you to the right extension professionals, extension specialists, or even the university staff that's here to help you. If you have any questions about soil judging, you can always contact any one of the professors at Virginia Tech. They will refer you to the right people. We're also on all the social media stuff if you want to keep up with really goofy photos, but yeah, that's what I would say for more information.
Clare Tallamy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And that is all the time we have for this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. This program is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, just visit our website, forthesoil.org. And if you should have a specific question about soil health, feel free to contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.